Hi, everyone. Welcome back to ENV 322. As promised, this podcast today is an interview with Professor Peter Newell from the University of Sussex, and we're talking about the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. So enjoy. Give you an official introduction. Peter Newell is Professor of International Relations at the University of Sussex and a general climate expert. He has been working in this area for 25 years as an academic, but also consulting for NGOs and IGOs and governments. And so I'm really excited that you agreed to join us today. I wanted to talk about the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, and I think it's really cool and intriguing. And I thought maybe we could start with you talking a little bit about the logic behind it, and if you can, what you think it might look like, and how, like, a bit about the structure and how that relates to what's out there in the world already.
Okay, so we can maybe sort of take those in turn and break them down a bit. I guess the first thing...
I've lost you.
Some campaigns over decades now, really, trying to sort of move beyond the fossil fuel economy in different ways, pushing for climate justice, energy democracy, protecting livelihoods. So in many ways, these proposals and ideas focus more on the supply side, are a sort of continuation of that. I mean, it takes the strategy in a different direction by trying to internationalize it and embed it within a more multilateral framework. But I do see it as a sort of continuation of things that have come before. I guess some of the more immediate drivers is obvious things around the untenability of the complete denial about the primary cause of the problem, if you like. People often talk about the F words not being named in the Paris Agreement, i.e. fossil fuels. You know, there's almost this structural, systematic neglect of talking about the elephant in the room. So that's clearly part of that. And things like the production gap that were released last year, and there's another one due, I think, coming out in December now, this year, from Stockholm Environment Institute and others, shows very clearly, you know, the misalignment between planned extraction of fossil fuels and the sort of trajectory that we need to be on to be compliant with the Paris Agreement. In fact, the last report showed that we're on course, governments around the world are on course to produce 120% more fossil fuels by 2030 that will be consistent with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. So, you know, it's just a basic and obvious fact that we need to restrict that expansion in one way or another. And I guess the Lofoten Declaration was sort of pushing that debate about the managed decline of fossil fuel production. It was signed back in August 2017, and I think about 600 or so organisations have now signed on to it from 76 countries. And so I think that's an important part of the story, that this is spreading. It's not a sort of just an NGO-driven thing. In fact, you may have seen Vancouver today announced its support for the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. So I know others involved in the campaign are trying to get more cities and even businesses and other actors to sign on and register their support for the proposal. So it's a rapidly expanding conversation. I mean, the declaration itself was named after Lofoten because it was a beautiful area in Norway, some islands where there was a proposal for oil drilling that was successfully resisted. So that was the impetus to sort of name the declaration after that area. And that area is still under threat, but the logic is to try and expand that debate around managed decline around the world by getting more organisations on board and push direction. So that's sort of the longer history and the background to it. I guess the shorter history was Andrew Sims and I having a beer in a pub in London and coming up with this idea. And it was on the 50th anniversary of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And so we were just thinking, well, what would it look like to have a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty? And then, 2 more beers were consumed, and then we started thinking about the 3 pillars of that treaty and how they could graft on to something that would be focused on addressing fossil fuels. And that's sort of how we came up with the idea of the 3 pillars. So I don't know if you want me to go through those briefly now, or...
Yeah, I think it would be really helpful for you to go through the 3 pillars, yeah.
Okay, so I mean, as it relates back to the original Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the first pillar is non-proliferation, And so in the fossil fuel context, that would imply a moratorium on further expansion, obviously starting with richer OECD plus countries. It would often be based on an assessment and potentially a registry, which is something that people are calling for at the moment, a registry of existing reserves, and then an assessment of their compatibility with Paris compliance, as a way of really mapping and working out what percentage of each fossil fuel would have to stay in the ground, which would then in turn trigger a set of difficult, controversial, contested, no doubt, conversations about sequencing of commitments, by region and by fuel type. So that's the first pillar, is the non-proliferation. It's really like do no harm, don't make it worse.
Right.
The second one is disarmament, which in this context refers to accelerated phase out and managed decline of existing investments and infrastructures. So that's going further. And of course, that would have to be underpinned by principles of a just transition to address both historical responsibility and inequities, but also the capacity that countries have to try and diversify their energy bases. Clearly, it's going to be much harder for some countries than others, and any treaty like this would have to recognise and deal with that. So that's the second pillar, is disarmament. And then the third one, again read off the nuclear treaty, is peaceful use, which in our context, and relating it to fossil fuels, is about financial, technological support to developing countries to adopt alternative, lower carbon, preferably renewable energy pathways. And that's really about the redirection of finance. I mean, we talked about a sort of global transition fund, sounds and is very ambitious, but it would be one way of steering money, pulling money out of the fossil fuel economy, if you like, and trying to push it into renewable development, and particularly supporting those countries that will struggle to diversify or where there's pressing questions of energy access. And it could be things like redirecting what I think the IMF still puts the figure at $10 million a minute, something like that, spent on fossil fuel subsidies globally. So there's just huge amounts of state aid still going towards bankrolling the fossil fuel economy that could be redirected. And we're seeing declarations from governments around the world. We're still hoping the UK will do something similar, pulling export finance from fossil fuels. So this, the momentum's there to some extent, but it needs obviously a much stronger push and to be embedded within a framework like this. So I guess overall, this treaty could take many different forms, of course, but it would have to deal with some of these issues. And for us, those three pillars were one way of structuring it.
So thanks for that really sort of thorough background. I want to go back to the Lofoten Declaration for a second, just because last week in our class we looked at the role of civil society. So I was just wondering if you could say a little bit about who drafted it, and where it came from, besides the pub.
Yeah, so there's a broad range of different groups working in that space. I wasn't directly involved in that declaration,
Okay.
so I can't say precisely who sort of authored it. But it's been a broad umbrella for bringing together a lot of civil society groups, and that's sort of what's happening now again around this new proposal for a Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. There's obviously environmental groups of one sort or another, but often faith-based organisations as well. Some labour unions increasingly getting involved. Indigenous peoples groups. I know active conversations are taking place with them around this new idea, and I know many of them have also signed up to that declaration. But it needs to go beyond that. The cities trying to engage, have conversations with groups like C40 and others about whether cities is a good lever point. And again, going back to the parallel with nuclear, there were nuclear-free cities, nuclear-free zones that were declared, back in the 80s around nuclear arms. And so I guess it's extending that logic and encouraging cities to do the same around fossil fuels. So I think there's a hugely important role for civil society in sort of pushing this idea.
That's really helpful. So these are really kind of parallel tracks, and that's something that we see often, that civil society starts kind of the ball rolling, and then there are other initiatives that kind of follow suit. So I think this is, I want to play devil's advocate here a little bit for the purposes of, for pedagogical purposes. I mean, I think this is obviously a very important idea, right? We're not going to fix climate change, quote unquote, fix it without stopping the combustion of fossil fuels. And what we've been focused on in global climate governance to date is really just slowing down, right? Mitigation and as you say, like not enough, not quickly enough. But even that has proven to be extremely controversial and difficult, and we know that it's not enough. So I'm wondering, I mean, you talk a little bit about the politics here, and you mentioned, first mover countries in your earlier comments. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the conditions you think this, if this could fly, and what the conditions would have to be for that to actually work politically.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess starting again with civil society we were just talking about, I mean, I think they have a crucial role really in sort of socialising the idea of the treaty.
Yeah.
And in a way, it's sort of putting down a symbolic marker to say, well, if not this, then what? Like clearly, as you said, there'll be huge opposition to a treaty like this. I mean, I heard from a colleague that an oil industry exec said that it was one of the greatest threats to their future existence. Which is very flattering for us because I think they're facing quite a few threats. This is just possibly one of them. But really pushing that idea that given the obvious gap between the level of action and ambition that's required and the planned extraction that some of the oil majors have, how are we going to possibly deal with this problem? We can't carry on like this unless we're committing society to absolute levels of climate chaos and destruction. So if not this, then what's the alternative way of making sure that large swathes of remaining fossil fuels stay in the ground? So I'm perfectly open to the idea that there's a better way of doing this. I just haven't thought of it yet. But what it does do is ride the wave to some extent and builds on the momentum that's to some extent already there. And I mean that in an economic sense around the falling price of renewables, particularly solar, obviously, but wind is expanding. Pressure to remove fossil fuel subsidies, the success of divestment campaigns. There's this broader questioning of the social license of fossil fuel companies to operate. And this is, one other approach that's building on that. And that's alongside, of course, all the resistance and, what Naomi Klein would call blockadia, the pipeline resistance, all of that, I think, is sort of moving in that direction. So I see it very much as part of that. So there's huge movement from below, but there is interest from above as well. So Mary Robinson, former Irish president, pushed the idea at the UN Security Council. We've had politicians, so in the UK, for example, Sir Ed Davey, who was the former climate minister, has spoken in favour of the idea in Parliament. We're having really good conversations with people around the world from developing countries who are actually quite keen on the idea, but obviously need to present it and advocate it within the context of an umbrella or a broader coalition. Many of them consider themselves, rightly so, I think, too weak to sort of speak out on this alone. They want cover. They want to know that other countries are going to come on board, and they obviously want to know more details about this. But there is growing interest from below and from above. And then we've seen, you referred to it as first movers. Yeah, there are some countries that have already put in place supply-side policies. So New Zealand, Costa Rica, Belize, France. Some of these countries have explicit moratoria or bans on the further exploration or exploitation of oil resources in most cases. There's bans on fracking in various jurisdictions around the world. So for me, some of this would start by building on those things, in a way saying, let's have a registry somewhere where we start to document these, at the moment, voluntary supply-side policies or policies the governments are putting in place, which, of course, they can also count as part of their NDCs, their nationally determined contributions under Paris. These are things they need to be doing anyway under the climate regime. Well, what if you sort of also rebadge them and cluster them under this type of arrangement? And so the idea would be to start to generate momentum as countries are under pressure to leave more resources in the ground, more fossil fuel resources in the ground. That the more and more countries do that, the more we can ask other countries to say, well, what are you doing about this? What's your contribution to this? And you can start to then over time create that momentum and that pressure from below. So it's not about working out every article and sub-article and clause of a new treaty before you can get this going. I see it as, in a way, clustering, quantifying, centralizing some of the sorts of things that are going on and building it that way too, as we try and build political support from above. And what's interesting about the campaign so far, it is, globalizing quite quickly. There are partners in Asia, Africa, Latin America that get involved in this, and so it becomes harder for the industry to say, "Oh, this is just a Western, Northern-driven, environmental, elite-driven, initiative." It's not. It's really something that's sort of slowly, obviously, because it's controversial and people want to know the details, but it is gaining momentum, and I'm hopeful that it can gain further ground, at least in sort of forcing the debate. This is what I go back to about its sort of symbolic value in lots of ways. If not this, then what? What's your preferred approach to doing this? And as I say, I think it is sort of seeking to ride the wave of momentum about things that are going on elsewhere.
Yeah, I wanted to. I think it is really. It actually gives me a lot of hope to hear about the diversity of actors who are actually really invested in this. You mentioned how this might work in conjunction with the Paris Agreement, because if countries actually do decide to do this, they could claim some of their activity towards their NDCs, their nationally determined contributions. It seems to me one of the things that's really appealing about this, as studying the mitigation end, is the simplicity of it, right? So what's happened in the climate regime to date is basically all of the politics, or at least a lot of the politics, in my view, have been shifted into these fights about measurement, right? And this is just either you're burning it or you're not. Which I think is very appealing because it can be much more sort of transparent and obvious. But I also, I worry about that, right? Because I think it could be a disincentive for countries. So I guess I'm wondering about that, and B, about if maybe how you see sort of co-benefits or other kinds of, you talked about nuclear-free cities and stuff like that, playing a role in maybe promoting more uptake.
Yeah, I think a range of framings and arguments are going to be needed for different actors. If I'm having conversations with fossil fuel actors, it would be entirely different to having conversations with cities or NGOs or others. You talked about co-benefits. I think there's a lot of work going on now. There's recent work, I think it was just a couple of weeks ago now, by Oil Change International, where they did all this work with workers in the fossil fuel sector about their willingness and inclination to retrain and start working in the renewable sector, because one of the arguments often held out is that those workers are resistant to this, that they're only trained to work in oil rigs or gas flaring sites, whatever it might be, and that it's not so easy to just retrain them. And of course, there will be costs. There are challenges there around any sort of just transition. But what it showed was, I can't remember the exact figure, but it's like 87% of those workers were keen and willing to transition, to be retrained and work in other sectors. So I think showing the jobs potential of this move, I think for lots of communities, the air quality aspect is an entry point. I saw some materials the other day from organisations in India calling for the treaty. And these are groups just involved in resistance to coal. They're fed up with the destruction of their communities, the poor air quality, all of those sorts of things, and they want alternatives. I think the appeal of it is to sort of avoid free riders. So the more and more countries are starting to take measures, the more they have an incentive to draw other countries into that sort of framework, so that they're not bearing the costs of this. I'm not underestimating for 1 minute the scale of the challenge, but in a way, it's a time for big, audacious ideas. Sure. The current approaches are clearly not working, and we need to be clear about the reasons they're not working. And some of that is, of course, the power of fossil fuel lobbies and just the sort of the carbon-intensive nature of the societies and the economies that we've organised. And that's not going to be rolled back very quickly. On the other hand, in a capitalist economy, businesses just want to make money. Most businesses do. And if you set limits and parameters and say, okay, these are the new rules of the game, and we need to just keep fossil fuels increasingly out of the picture, these are the ways in which you can, legitimately make wealth in this new, greener, low-carbon economy. They will start to shift their money. And that's this is the sort of bigger story, is about finance, I think. A lot of the people I work with are making this argument about risk, the risks of ongoing money going into fossil fuels. And we see sensitization around this, around divestment movements, shareholder activism, things like the Carbon Disclosure Project, these pressures to disclose where the money's going, and then hopefully pressure to move that money out of fossil fuels and into renewables. So I see that as another sort of key entry point. And some of the people we've been having conversations are institutional investors. Churches invest huge amounts of money, some of them still in fossil fuels, but many of them are really keen to move. And they have huge assets and endowments. And as you know, universities have been under pressure to do similar sorts of things. So I think it's a complex puzzle, right? I mean, the fossil fuel incumbent regime, it has it's a many-headed hydra, if you like.
Yeah.
And we need to approach this in lots of ways. Some of it's cultural work. So I know colleagues working on what they call badvertising, trying to sort of put restrictions on carbon-intensive advertising for SUVs or cheap flights or whatever it might be. So, it's about reducing demand, it's about presenting alternatives, it's about pushing for the co-benefits that you were talking about around health or jobs, all those sorts of things. So it really does, all actors, or a broad range of actors, will have to be on board for this to get any traction at all. So there are arguments you can make to cities, there's arguments you would want to make to businesses and to civil societies, and arguments to make to governments. And I think, we need to push simultaneously in all those directions to get momentum behind this. But I think that for me, it's often, these sorts of bold ideas get dismissed as being politically unrealistic. And so the question back to people arguing that is, how realistic is it to say that we're going to commit to a world of 3 or 4 degrees warming and all the catastrophic consequences that implies? If that's a sort of normal, rational, logical thing to do, and we're just going to accept that for me is unrealistic. It's shameful, and we can do better than that, frankly. And so this is, one idea, one approach to trying to tackle it in a new way. But I'm hoping it's the sort of umbrella for a whole set of other campaigns and strategies that are going on around the world, moving in a sort of similar direction.
Well, I think that is a really excellent and hopeful way to end our discussion. I will just ask you one brief question for my students. If they want to get involved or learn more, can you make any suggestions about where to go or what to do?
Yeah, so there's already a website. If you just Google Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, you'll get taken to the website, and they're accepting endorsements now from individuals. As I say, cities and others are starting to sign up. Organisations are affiliating with this. So yeah, please get involved. Push the idea with other organisations that you might be involved with. Some of you may be involved in divestment movements on campus, or other NGOs that you work with. So just keep asking the question, is this the sort of thing you think you could support? If not this, then what? Because clearly we need more action around supply side policies and other ways of keeping fossil fuels in the ground. As I say, for me, this is just one idea. I'm happy if we get there by a different route. But we do need to leave the large majority of those resources in the ground. So yeah, have a look at the website. There's going to be a separate set of resources coming online fairly soon.
Excellent.
Think about doing your papers on this. There's plenty of scope to do interesting dissertations in this area. So, I mean, really it's about using the skills you have, time you have available in the place you are to do what you can, really. I mean, that's true of so many other things. It's true here too. So as activists, as students, as members of families and communities, there's many, many things that can be done. So I would encourage you to join the conversation.
Great. Peter, thank you so much. I mean, Professor Newell, thank you so much for this really thought-provoking and inspiring conversation. And I wish you the best of luck with the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty going forward.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me.
Thank you for coming.
That's all. Good luck with all your work.
Okay.
All right.
Take care.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.